would like to take a moment to dedicate this talk to the memory of Berta Cáceres of Honduras, who was killed last Thursday for her efforts in defense of the land and indigenous communities. Let us take a moment of silence to listen to the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, and to pray for her family and indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you. Just would like to open with this poem from Rilke's Book of Hours. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? So just a brief personal background. I was born and raised in LA, California, in the Japanese Catholic community of St. Francis Xavier Chapel and Maryknoll School, one of the few Japanese Catholic communities I've discovered in my life. It began in 1912 as one of only 2 missions established by Maryknoll in the continental United States before World War II. My father Vincent, of a Buddhist family, was one of the first baptisms and found home in this faith community throughout his life, whether in Los Angeles, Manzanar, one of the 10 internment camps for Japanese during World War II, or here in Chicago, where he met my mother Agnes and began raising our family. And that's actually her on the photo in the flyer. Just wanted to share that, my 97-year-old mother. Ultimately returning to California, they raised 5 of us as part of the parish and grammar school, together known simply as Maryknoll to us, where we were nurtured in faith and culture. So I was taught by Maryknoll Sisters, yet came to know my vocation through a partially blind 6-year-old indigenous boy named Magdaleno from Tlaxcala, Mexico, during an immersion trip with campus ministers right after college. Magdaleno shared his vulnerability, strength, and radiance that sparked something inside of me. He revealed Christ to me and radiated God's love for the most vulnerable. This encounter would eventually lead me to enter the Maryknoll Sisters and mission with the Aymara people in the southern Andes of Peru. So there's a map of Peru, and if you go to the south, you see Puno, and you see a little blue spot, that's the lake, Lake Titicaca. And so to the right is an enlarged map of the lake, and the Bolivian-Peru border cuts right through the lake and the Aymara nation. So actually the larger portion of the Aymara people are in Bolivia. The first time I set foot and eyes upon the Altiplano high plains of Peru, I had expected a barren, wind-blown desert, since the previous year had suffered the worst drought in over 2 decades, the effects of El Nino. Teamwork. At 12,000 feet above sea level, just to show you the top of the Andes, a normal year brings constant challenges to the narrow margins of subsistence agriculture that sustains the Aymara people. Cycles of drought, flooding, frost, hail, and insects are a constant threat to a good harvest. Today, the patterns are worsening due to climate change. I heard stories of campesinos in place of their weakened cattle pulling their own wooden plows through the dry caked earth in order to plant potato and seed grains. How could anything hope to grow? I would soon learn that the Altiplano is a land of stark contrasts. With only a month of new rains, the dry plains transformed into verdant fields after being respectfully coaxed into sharing her fruits by wisdom of centuries and relationship with the earth, the Pachamama. So that's Chacra's field of potatoes. There are stark socioeconomic political contrasts as well as indigenous peoples are marginated in their own land. Yet faith in what was not yet, hope in the small stirrings of life the size of a seed, enabled life to enter the apparent barrenness. That same initial week, I also participated in a rito de perdón, pardon ceremony, a regular practice in the campesino communities. Standing together in an open field, the new rains washed away the tears of forgiveness as members of the entire campesino community of Pucuyo asked and received pardon from each other, renewing and reestablishing the right relationship among them that is so vital and integral for their living, for their very survival. During Semana Santa, Holy Week in Chiquito, the small town nearest to the campesino community of Chinchera, where we live, Holy Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are reserved for the procession of the campesinos, versus the townspeople who have the Triduum, another marginalization. Mary, so here this is from a retablo, but it actually is very close to what it appears. So those are both andas, and Jesus and Mary. I go on to describe here. Let's see. These are large andas or platforms with the figures riding on top, surrounded by flowers and candles, carried along by at least a dozen people, each followed by an increasing number of persons singing and praying. Mary is processed one evening, then Jesus on another. However, on Holy Wednesday, they are both processed, leaving from separate chapels and meeting in the main plaza. From opposite ends of the plaza, Mary and Jesus begin to move towards each other in a very slow ritual of bowing to each other 3 times, the 12 carriers managing a very tricky choreography, until they are face to face, symbolizing that they are asking and receiving pardon from each other. It is a cathartic moment for the whole community, as the carriers and all those behind the andas are also doing the same, asking and receiving pardon. It was a wonderful and amazing moment for me the first time I witnessed it. I said to myself, wait, aren't Jesus and Mary supposed to be sinless and perfect? Why would they need to ask pardon of each other? Of course, it was a revelatory moment when I was evangelized, that reconciliation, love, and mercy are intrinsic to God's nature. As the scripture tells us, be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. In mission, we enter into the transformative process of crossing many kinds of borders: geographic, psychological, social, cultural, religious, and spiritual. Initially, one feels like a stranger in the wilderness, yet recognizes that the people and land are stamped with the very image of God and are mirrors that reflect the sacred, giving one a worldwide heart. And the stranger in the wilderness soon becomes friend. I had expected a barrenness of tremendous difference as my greatest challenge in entering the world of the Aymara people. Yet I often experienced a resonance and sense of coming home that would move me to tears. It's the altitude, my Maryknoll companions would lightheartedly say, bumping along in an old Jeep. This would become a familiar phrase as a reason for many things, from headaches to strong emotions to canonical improvisations. We used to say that canon law didn't take effect above 10,000 feet. My small stirrings of faith, the size of a seed, were received and embraced in friendship in their practice of philoxenia, love of strangers, or hospitality. These new friends have names such as Candelaria Quispe Mamani, Pedro Copaja, Carmen Cayo Mamani. The Aymara people reveal the depth of spirit and their tenacious hope amid suffering, sustained by their deep popular religiosity and practices of collective remembering. I experienced in Peru among the Aymara what Johann Baptist Metz describes as a mysticism of open eyes, an increased readiness to perceive, to see more, not less, to name visible and invisible suffering and pay attention to it, to be moved to compassion, to suffer with, to respond, and in so doing to experience God's presence in suffering and hope. This expansion of love, being a witness to and participant in the cross and resurrection in our midst, the Christ encounter, gave me new eyes and new ways to see the experience of my own Japanese American history, and a new heart now able to perceive the suffering and hope that was lived in the lives of my parents' and grandparents' generations through immigration, detention, to redress and beyond. Popular religious practice among the Aymara relates profoundly with the earth. This no doubt strengthened their resistance and hope during centuries of colonization. As in many areas around the globe, many are migrating to the urban centers for hopes of finding work, migrating to the coast. However, annually they return to their fiesta principal to reconnect to their people and land, feeling Pachamama's and God's embrace of them once again. The Fiesta de la Cruz, Feast of the Cross, involves reaching the summit of the mountains around the community, in some places requiring an overnight vigil of prayer and trust until dawn, and in just a little stone shack here in there. The land holds memory, embedded with spiritual resonance through regular pilgrimages, prayers, and rituals. Even as I was in pastoral ministry in Peru as a Maryknoll sister from 1983 to 1994, the resonance and affinities with their unknown world began to challenge and encourage me to enter into my own unknown world as a Japanese American woman, third generation Sansei, to enter into our underside of history. Even at great geographic distance, both horizontal and vertical, the Japanese American collective process of remembrance that also involved the movement for redress had great impact on me. I reconnected with my own heritage by participating in the Manzanar pilgrimage, a return to the Japanese American concentration camp. Such pilgrimages revisit shadowed ground, uncovering sacred traces of suffering and hope. The land holds memory. The cemetery obelisk at Manzanar expresses the message, this is the place of consolation for all of humanity. It is about reconnection with each other, with our ancestors, with mystery and the depth of life. It is not an escape like tourism, but a return to the center of pivotal events that have marked us and to narratives implanted in the land itself. The pilgrim's journey seeks a restoration of wholeness by a recentering, a re-entering, and a recovery of history, and recovering from history. It is a rediscovery that we are part of a living and vital collective memory. We journey together, experiencing more together than we could alone. I'm trying to decide if I should show the film now or later, but I think a little later. So there will be a film where a short film, a 7-minute film, that you can see what it's like. I know it's difficult. But I do want to give a little bit of background on the redress process because it pertains to what's happening in our country today. On July 31st, 1980, U.S. President Carter signed the bill to create the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC. Its purpose was to review the Executive Order 9066 of February 19, 1942, signed by President Roosevelt, that set in motion the evacuation and detention of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the West Coast during World War II. I believe it's the closest history has come to a truth commission. 2/3 of those interned were U.S. citizens, and more than half were children. Previously, in 1976, President Ford had revoked Executive Order 9066. There were 10 public hearings of the CWRIC across the nation, D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, to name some of them. And 750 witnesses eventually testified. In 1983, the CWRIC released its findings, which concluded that the exclusion, expulsion, and incarceration were not justified by military necessity. That decision was based on racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It recommended that Congress pass a joint resolution to recognize the grave injustice done, offer the nation's apologies, and a one-time per capita symbolic compensation payment of $20,000 to each of the approximately 80,000 surviving persons at that time. On August 10, 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that granted such redress, which also included provisions for a public education fund and the authorization of the construction of a National Japanese American Memorial in Washington, D.C., which had its inauguration ceremony in November of 2000. On October 9, 1990, the first redress payments were made, with the apology letter signed by President George H.W. Bush. The complete text of the apology reads as follows. A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. But we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. Sincerely, George H.W. Bush. So just to notice how many presidents are involved in this, which means Congress was involved and the Senate was involved, and yet I don't think we've learned from history. After the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, the days of remembrance and pilgrimages still continue to this day in response to the continued need for healing of the wounds of both persons and communities. Joy Kogawa writes that to a person for whom community was the essence of life, destruction of community was the destruction of life. Internment was an attack not merely on persons and their possessions, but on their collective and therefore spiritual existences, as it meant the termination of their communities on the West Coast. The pilgrimages opened up the deeper layers where resilience and hope reside amidst the suffering. And where only meaningless pain remained, these collective spaces began to break down isolation and offered the possibility to bear that pain together. These aspects of the ordeal affected both the Issei first and Nisei second generations, who lived through the experience, and the Sansei third, who inherited a legacy of painfulness and injustice that was left unexplained due to the silence of their parents and the U.S. history books. The invisibility of this chapter of American history is not simply a matter of oversight. Rather, it can be traced to issues of unresolved meaning and conflicts over memory. Carolyn Chung Simpson contends that the internment existed in the immediate post-war as a vacated history, where there are only traces of the event because the cultural mediation of memory that the event entailed was too disruptive to be borne by conventional historical accounts of the nation at the time. The reputation of U.S. democracy at war against Hitler's racial tyranny in the world and the myth of exceptionalism being constructed would be undermined by the incongruity of the internment, motivated by racial factors and creating second-class citizens. This incongruity would expose the arbitrariness of the enterprise of national history, an American dream of democratic ideals only for some. Therefore, the internment camps would be portrayed in the media either as model democratic small towns featuring the normative aspects of camp life and the spirit of loyalty of Japanese Americans who had undertaken this challenge as part of their patriotic duty, or as justified detention camps of defiant and distrustful troublemakers imaged as fanatical Oriental tyrants. This bifurcation elides the complexity of the lived reality. Interviews with the Nisei reveal not an unquestioned loyalty to the United States, but a range of perspectives that indicate a critical consciousness that understood the ideals of American democracy and their compromise through the contradictory treatment of Japanese Americans based on race. The historical process of remembering by forgetting, of discursive inclusion that works to evade or displace, characterized the American recognition of the Japanese American experience in the 1940s and 1950s. The euphemistic terms of evacuation and relocation implied a situation of natural disaster rather than the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestries, citizens and non-citizens, who were termed non-aliens and aliens, who lived in California, the western parts of Oregon and Washington, and the southern part of Arizona, the designated military security zone of exclusion. The paradox of nation building in the U.S. society reveals the shadows across the American dream. Violence and tragedy have been both a source of our bonding as a nation as well as fracturing our social bonds, dividing us into winners and losers, victors and victims. Inhabiting these shadows may precisely cast light upon them by allowing access to their hidden knowledge and truth on a path towards reconciling their conflicting meanings and consequences. Yet as Lillian Hellman notes, we are a people who do not want to keep much of the past in our heads. It is considered unhealthy in America to remember mistakes, neurotic to think about them, and psychotic to dwell upon them. Unfortunately, just this past November, a Virginia mayor cited the internment of Japanese Americans as a model for how we ought to treat Syrian refugees. Fortunately, his comments raised a firestorm of protest and correction from various political leaders. However, a poignant objection came from George Takei, who you might remember as Mr. Sulu from Star Trek, who was interned as a child from at Tule Lake. He then invited the mayor to the Broadway musical Allegiance, which is exploring the internment experience. I have seen it, it's very good. Theologically speaking, however, a return to the past is necessary for depth of meaning and a moving forward in integrity. As H. Richard Niebuhr writes in The Meaning of Revelation, what is past is not gone. It abides in us as our memory. What is future is not non-existent, but present in us as our potentiality. Time here is organic and is social, so that past and future associate with each other in the present. Time in our history is a dimension of our life and of our community's being. We are not in this time, but it is in us. The revelatory moment is one which makes our past intelligible. Through it, we understand what we remember what we have forgotten, and appropriate as our own past, much that seemed alien to us. End quote of Niebuhr. The imprinting of historical memory on the American landscape, noted by cultural geographer Kenneth Foote, gives evidence that the tendency to forget simply obscures rather than breaks with the past. Foote asserts that the sites of violence and tragedy themselves force people to face the meaning of the events, that the inscriptions in the landscape are a sort of earth writing. Lisa Yoneyama agrees that mnemonic sites or memoryscapes interrupt the process of amnesia, that the power of such spaces and the accompanying spatial strategies of corresponding testimonies and storytelling produce new subjectivities. Land holds memory. The imprinting of historical memory on the American landscape indicates that the places and sites themselves are resources for our engagement, welcoming our attentive presence as that which seemed absent beckons our embrace. Through such spatial knowings and memoryscapes, the pilgrimages to former internment campsites are efforts that contribute to overcoming the general U.S. characteristic of collective amnesia, to restore our anamnesis, our remembering, and our solidarity of memory that gives opportunity for compassion, communion, and commitment instead of antagonisms within our intercultural reality. The Greeks had two words, mneme and anamnesis, to designate memory. Mneme is memory as a noun, a popping into mind of a memory, while anamnesis is the process of remembering, the search, the recall or recollection. The ana of the Greek word anamnesis signifies returning to and recovering what had earlier been experienced or learned. The search for memory is directed against forgetting. The depth of meaning often arrives in the inconclusive absence, precisely by sitting with it. The cross of our Christian faith insists on God's presence at this moment, contemplating the mystery of God's grace in absence, in rupture, in betrayal and shock, in physical hardship, in psychological scars and denial. These forces of rupture would rather have us forget about the infinite horizon of love in which we live. Thus, our Christian anamnesis returns us to the experience of love and mercy in the very desire and effort to bring about that love and mercy where it is absent, the anamnesis of Eucharist. In other words, the question of identity formation in recovering the past and recovering from history is not identity for its own sake, as much as this is cause for celebration, but for compassionate relatedness and action with and towards other human beings threatened by similar conditions. Arab Americans in a post-9/11 world, undocumented immigrants, family detention centers for the women and children fleeing violence, Syrian refugees, reparations for African American, Native Americans. New stars are birthed from dark spaces in the galaxy. That's also something I was very aware of in the high altitude sky. The transformative journeys of the pilgrimages may not begin with wonder and imagination, yet this is often revealed to the participants along the way. I'd like to read this quote from Robert Shimabukuro on the first day of remembrance near Seattle in 1978. 500 were expected, 2,000 came. In family cars, tucked into the caravan, rolling along slowly from an abandoned baseball stadium field in Seattle, down Interstate 5, off at exit 142B, following the signs to Puyallup, ironically called Camp Harmony. Nisei, who had promised never to go back and had never talked of camp to their Sansei children when they were children, when they were in high school, when they were in college, when they lived at home, started talking now. Families had gone into camps. Families had not come out. Today, families went in and took over, and families would come out, joined by the realization that the fear, the doubts, humiliation, and anxiety that isolated family members from each other, and families from families, were shared in common by all who lived through the evacuation in camps. The suffering each carried was no longer suspected of being a personal mental illness, and the burden of suffering and bitterness was lifted at the return to Camp Harmony. The atmosphere was more picnic than political, and the feeling all around was downright affectionate. As one participant, Shosuke, expressed, "I was a little leery of going out there. I hadn't set foot on those premises since the days it was Camp Harmony. And much to my surprise, all the horrible feelings and memories I expected to assail me were of no matter. Standing there by the grandstand, alone with my friend Henry, I found to be the strangest elation. 'I'm free, Henry yelled and jumped up and down and nodded at Shosuke. It wasn't until I was standing there that I really felt released from camp. I think it was because I went there of my own free will. The Manzanar pilgrimage has its roots in the compassion of two religious leaders, Reverend Sentoku Maeda, a Buddhist priest, and his friend, Reverend Shoichi Wakahiro, a Christian minister. Every year after Manzanar closed in November 1945, they would return to the eastern Sierras of California to the Manzanar Cemetery, protected by the Soul Consoling Tower, the obelisk, with a small group of Issei on Memorial Day to pray for the dead who were without family to do so. In 1969, the energies and struggles of the civil rights and redress movements converged with this practice of prayer and remembrance. To the young Sansei students and their friends in the Asian American Studies movement, Reverend Maeda suggested the pilgrimage to help release the stories of their Nisei parents and led their religious ceremonies, initiating the present-day annual tradition of the Manzanar pilgrimage, held on the last Saturday in April. As a way of inhabiting shadowed ground, the pilgrimages reclaim them as sites of suffering and hope in our journeys that evoke layers of meaning, memory, mourning, healing, and ongoing commitment for reconciliation and justice. They are expressive of a cultural cosmology that highlights the relatedness of all beings and seeks to restore relationships broken by historical injuries, to restore our sense of deep belonging to each other, to the earth and universe, to God and mystery. one more paragraph and we have the film. On the Manzanar pilgrimage, Shinto, Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim aspects of the ritual converge to create an integrated whole during the interfaith ceremony, which provides an opportunity to recover our Japanese-American cultural tradition of multiple religious belonging that works together for the continuing life of the community. The interfaith ceremony and spirit of the hybrid Obon dancing to honor the dead provides an opportunity to extend hospitality and invitation to all participants on pilgrimage to experience this interreligious solidarity that perhaps can more freely happen in the liminal space and outside of church building walls, where pilgrimage itself is a kind of moving spatial liturgy. This interreligious solidarity is particularly critical in these post-9/11 times when Muslim Arab Americans are the new targets caught in between the forces of war.
My name is Shimizu, and I came here because my grandmother was interned in Roar, Arkansas, and I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me was seeing my last name on the 10,000 names that were here. Even though I wasn't related, it stood out to me because I realized that my name could have been on there because of the fact that I'm half Japanese. And even though my whole life I wasn't treated as one, I still could have been just as much the same. And it made me understand the Japanese, knowing that they were American citizens, and being put in here, it really stood out to me.
This is my first time here at Manzanar, and it's interesting to compare the two camps. This one, of course, is much bigger, and it's got much more trees, greeneries, and that kind of stuff. This particular pilgrimage, I've been on other pilgrimages to Topaz, but this one, it seems like there's a lot of youth, and I'm glad to see that, because that way, we can pass our stories on, our history.
To come on this pilgrimage to pay respect and honor to the Nisei folks who have been here, who have really been my family, although not biologically related. I feel like they've really nurtured me and formed a lot of my sentiments and ways of looking at the world, and I really admire them a lot, and so I wanted to come to pay respect. I grew up with animosity towards Japanese people when I became politicized as a Filipino American, because of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines, and I wanted to be able to kind of heal that and be able to build community and be in solidarity with other folks, because it just how messy war is and how it affects everybody. It's very complex, and it isn't as easy as like putting blame on one person or another group of people just because your own suffered.
I guess part of my motivation for coming is I just haven't had a lot of Asian American history in the past, and so it was kind of learning some new things that really got me thinking about sort of what are my connections as a Chinese American to sort of my Japanese brothers and sisters, and I really came here with that desire to sort of see begin to think about what those connections are.
One of the things I did was just this interfaith thing that happened right now. It was really important for me to see different people with different beliefs coming together and honoring the lives of the people here. And it's just amazing to me how there are so many different ways that people have experienced life here, and at the same time there are so many different ways that people experience God, and just being able to see that people don't have to hold those things against each other anymore. So.
I guess one of the things that it came up for me when I was walking through the interpretive center today was just sort of how strongly I felt I identified with this, with the Issei, in terms of being an immigrant to this country. I'm a first and a half generation immigrant, so I came over when I was a teenager, and just sort of this feeling of not being fully home in either place, but having chosen a place, or my family having chosen a place, and kind of just sort of, I'm not really sure what yet to think about, but it was just amazing to me how much it was just a visceral reaction. It's like, I get what you mean, I get what when people sort of doubt, oh, are you American? And even sort of thinking about maybe the Issei, maybe they were thinking, maybe I don't want to be part of this America, and having those mixed feelings.
Our own people, and then we crucified them. We put them in prison, and they suffered. The stories that I heard from Paz and Toru about the heat and the freezing cold and being split from family, and it was a real suffering. But the hope I see in that is that because of their suffering, I am more free. Because they've told their stories to us, we are more free.
I didn't know anything about Manzanar prior to taking the class, just sort of hints here and there in the textbooks that we use in Hawaii.
Any lessons you think we could take towards these other struggles?
Well, hearing the stories from the people who sort of suffered, I think it's always it's hard when you fight for something and everybody's silent or everybody just died. So I think that there's an urgency to listen to the stories of the people who sort of who's been bombed, who suffered in the war, and that's it.
Dark spaces birth new stars. This resonates with the Yamaniwa of the Aymara cosmology. Up at the high altitude of 12,000 feet, the stars are so numerous in the rarefied atmosphere that there are names for the dark spaces in the midst of the Milky Way. One such dark space is named Yamaniwa, a mother Yama and her offspring. Together they journey across the night sky as they are illuminated by the principal constellation of the Southern Cross. Both the stars and dark spaces orient the living. The Yama-niwa also holds deeper significance in Andean mythology, as this Yama and offspring were the sacrificed animals during the first destruction of the world sometime after it was first created. In the night sky, the dancing stars of the Milky Way are their tears, streaming profusely from their shadowy faces. The Yama-niwa appeared on the horizon for the first time at the beginning of a deluge, the first rainy season that initiated a new age. As Lawrence Sullivan noted, the symbolism of weeping is co-involved here with the material reality of flooding rainwaters and a new quality of time. Our return to the dark spaces of our experience as Japanese Americans, to value both loss and wisdom, to inhabit the shadowed ground of internment through days of remembrance and pilgrimage, as integral to the movement for redress, reparations, and healing, has in many ways marked a new quality of time for our history. Our return to memory, recovering history, and recovering from history, mourning and resistance, participates in the tearful release of Rainwaters for Life, to create a space for community to mourn and honor our dead and our losses, to remember the sacrifices and resilience of the previous generations, to begin to restore our narrative and relationships, and thus strengthen to move forward together brings joy in the deep sense to celebrate life as we reclaim it. The losses endured that cannot be recovered require the ability to mourn rather than be forgotten or compromised. The ability to mourn is a measure of our humanity. It honors the forgotten dead and lost. It holds them in memory forever. As Gustavo Gutierrez says, vivid in the memory of God. It is the love often incomprehensible in times of trial that ultimately sustains. Just to close with Rilke's Book of Hours. I love the dark hours of my being. My mind deepens into them. There I can find, as in old letters, the days of my life already lived, and held like a legend and understood. Then the knowing comes. I can open to another life that's wide and timeless. So I am sometimes like a tree rustling over a gravesite and making real the dream of the one its living roots embrace, a dream once lost among sorrows and songs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaruko, bringing together the two worlds, the deep worlds of the Aymara with the Japanese American experience, very touching in that way. Now we have time for some questions and comments, and Jaruko can field questions. So those who have comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Just a commercial. So that film was actually a commercial for those pilgrimages. I used to teach a course, and then we used to take the students on pilgrimage. So I hope to do that again someday. I needed a break though.
I really resonate with this as a first-generation Vietnamese American. My question is, for those generations, the second generations, third generations of people who don't care anymore about their heritage, how would you say you could inspire those younger generations to try to re-grasp that cultural heritage that they come from? I'm experiencing this kind of in my ministry right now. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. It's in people,
Yeah.
and something just needs to awaken it. You make them take a class. Just the encounter, the story. I mean, it's just as hard sometimes to get the previous generations to talk about it, to tell the stories. And that's why actually place was so significant. It somehow supported that generation because they're engaging with something concrete. Oh, I used to live here, or I remember when this happened. And then the stories just come flowing out. So it's the way to find that, you know, I don't know if it's through symbols or even a certain holiday event. I don't know if a Lunar New Year way of storytelling moment would be helpful. But I just find it sort of catches on. So that's, yeah. Even here in Chicago, they're now the Japanese community is starting to take groups to Manzanar. They're getting funding for it, and so it slowly, and then don't give up hope, because it might skip a generation. But it's part of us. So I think it might be helpful to respond to sometimes what that hole is in who we are gets acted out in other ways. I know in the Japanese community, you know, drugs and other things, people thought, you know, like it said, that people have like mental illness, but it's really about a social illness or a need for social wellness by recovering some of these memories. So you might even be responding to those needs first that might lead to it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Following up on this question, many of us here in this room are from the white dominant culture and don't have personal memories or stories like this. How do we educate many prejudiced middle-class white Americans who don't want to know about maybe what we've done to blacks, to Indians? You brought up sort of Japanese. I had the privilege of living with a Japanese Redemptorist priest, and he used to tell his stories about how he got ripped out of Oregon. So what advice could you give us, especially as we see this Trumpism spreading against the Muslims? I think you address an issue that's a hot button issue right now that we can relive again in the so-called liberated 21st century.
Well, I do this simple exercise of looking at your name. So, Joanne Jaruko Doi is my full name. But within each part of your name, there's a story or there's meaning. And often when I've done this with, you know, a diversity of peoples, when I first taught this class, I thought it'd be Asian American seminarians that would come. I had to close the class at 20, and it was really a very diverse group of people. And a lot of people had memories of people being taken out of their classroom. So it's sort of part of the general memory. But anyway, when we do the exercise around the name, a lot of people don't know what a certain name means and why, or who were they named after, and it actually sometimes touches on a painfulness that why don't they know? Because I would be very surprised. I can't imagine, there are very few, we're a country of immigrants. What immigrant communities have not had their hardships? I just think we tend to want to just leave that behind and forget it. So I don't know, I think it would help if people got in touch with their stories of struggle in the past. Other than that, that's kind of your homework to figure out. That's what I would kind of think, but it's hard for me to do a lot with, I can't do much more than suggest that. But, yeah, okay. I see a hand back there. And then what
Thank you for your presentation. I was really moved by it. I have two questions. The first question is, what is the first step, based on your own experience, the first step toward reconciliation? And the second question is, between reconciliation and forgiveness, which one brings healing?
Okay, where are you, Bob? Oh, what was the first part of the question? I got caught in the second one.
The first step toward reconciliation.
Well, I think what we did in this case, you have to start you have to start listening to the pain. Now what I learned in this process, I mean, they often call Asians as, we're silent kind of peoples. We don't cause waves, et cetera, et cetera. But I realized the silence has its own language. There's a silence that something's been repressed, but there's also a silence that bears meaning and bears painfulness. You know, when anything's very moving or painful or maybe joyful, there's silence around it. So I had to start to learn to listen to the silence of my parents' generation. Because, Sansei, my generation, were raised during the 60s. Why didn't you protest? Why didn't you, kind of talk about it more? And then realizing, they were communicating it in their own way. So I'd say that was our first step. We had to start listening to our pain because there was sort of a hole and we didn't know who we were or what our narrative was, or we had identity difficulties. So we had to listen to our painfulness and then listen to the generations before us. I mean, for them to survive, they had to put it aside and tell us the good stories about baseball and playing card games in the camps and all the great friends they made. And I'm glad they told us those stories because they had even more, they were more meaningful to me when I realized the backdrop that all those good stories were coming out of. But I had to learn what that backdrop was. So I'd say that's the first step. And the other one was reconciliation and forgiveness.
Yeah. Which one brings healing?
Like both, there's about same one, they're parts of the whole. And it's a process. So the healing in the Japanese American community is still going on. There are layers of painful stories that are still emerging. But as you can see, at least legally, we've had a law passed and a formal apology given and, restitution, a symbolic payment. We've had a gesture, but the healing, I felt that basically opened the door, and the shame was lifted. And so we could start revisiting those stories and narratives and share them with each other. So, how did I do? Oh, over here.
Yeah, I think you just answered part of my question. There are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, honor and shame are two very important dynamics. I don't want to call it baggage because extreme can lead to really detrimental consequences. But the two dynamics there, honor and shame. You mentioned that. I think I was wondering how much that dynamics affect the first generation, and how much that affecting you now that shame is the recognition of the shame is to be able to tell the story that heals the shame. And then I guess what the Americans have done, the U.S. have done is to recognize their shame, and then we're bringing honor to people. And so can you mention a little bit of this dynamic, honor and shame? Is there a play on what's going on with your family and your experience? How's that?
Oh yeah,
process?
It's been written about. It's like a rape victim feels like they caused it to happen, so it's their fault that they caused the abuse. So it's that feeling ashamed in that sense, and it's also feeling they felt ashamed that Japan attacked the U.S. Even though my generation is like Japan didn't worry about us here, we were like collateral damage. Then you see, well, it's military governments or military strategies of governments that create collateral damage. But yeah, I'd say that that affected a lot of the silence on the community's part. Besides the, trauma victims, in order to move with it, you can't keep repeating what happened to you and be re-traumatized. So it's a lot of reasons happening all at once. And that's why it takes a collective movement to move out of it also. So you're trying to restore the relatedness, both within the community, with other communities that are, now we are a diverse community. So it's very multiple and complex and yet simple at the same time.
as part of the story, were there Americans, soldiers who put people in the camps? Have they been a part of the remembering? Have they come back, or have they been in touch?
Yes, that there were actually there was 2 units, the 442nd and the 100th Battalion, that were Japanese American units. They're drafted or enlisted out of the camps. So actually that's part of the tension in the community. Some felt they had to fight to prove their loyalty, and others resisted the draft. They said they would be happy to fight. This is more in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, but as long as they were detained in these prison camps, then they protested and wouldn't. So then they were sent to another prison. And then that was a split in the community. You know, why aren't you loyal? Why are you disloyal? And so those factors are just coming together. So there was a reconciliation within the Japanese American community. I'd say the year 2000 that happened, because then the ones that resisted were ostracized from kind of the mainstream of the Japanese American community. But yeah, they're very much part of the internal story of the camps, but also when they were trying to establish Manzanar as a National Historic Site, the town was protesting until the veterans showed up in their uniforms to a town meeting. And then the Japanese American veterans showed up. And then the people in the town realized, you know, the stories, they connected more on that level. But there was a lot of Caucasian staff in the camps, the librarians, a lot of administration. So all the stories, what I liked about the National Park Service is their approach is, so 10,000 lives in Manzanar itself. 10,000 lives, 10,000 stories. They're not trying to find one master narrative of Manzanar, because there are so many. And the effort is to try to surface what the stories are.